The Electoral Commission of South Africa is hosting a two-day symposium on political party funding. This event is being held in Durban and aims to encourage dialogue about the future of political funding and its impact on multi-party democracy. It also seeks to support political parties and independent candidates to strengthen their chances of election success through well-resourced campaigns. This comes 4 years after the implementation of the Political Party Funding Act of 2018. Joining us now is independent election analyst Michael Atkins to discuss this further. A very good afternoon to you, Michael. Thank you very much for your time. One of the big issues, of course, over the past few years has been the influence of donor funding on our elections and more broadly on our political landscape. One wonders whether this has been the case over the past day and a half or so that this particular symposium was being held.
Yes, you're correct, and thank you. The symposium was actually an excellent opportunity to reflect on the 4 years since the implementation of the Political Funding Act. But what you say that it's in recent years that funding has had an effect, it's more that because of this act, we are aware as the public of donations and of who is supporting which parties and some of the amounts of money that are being made available. So it's actually because of the legislation, the subject is up for discussion, and I would say that funding has always played a role in our politics, but at least now we're aware of it and we can discuss it and weigh up the effects of the funding as we look at our political environment.
But then how does that measure up with the decision? I mean, Parliament has decided to double the annual limit for receiving private funding to like 30 million a year.
Well, that's actually an interesting question. Parliament hasn't really decided. Parliament made a recommendation in their resolution for the President to decide. The Political Funding Act, as it was amended last year, gives the sole and final discretion to the President. There are certain factors that he must take into account with the donation limit. There is nothing listed for him that he is forced to consider with the reporting threshold. So these are recommendations. The President must now act on this resolution. He is fully entitled to either keep the limits the same, he can accept their recommendations, or he can come up with his own figures. So yes, the parliamentary call it decision or resolution was interesting, but that isn't the final word on what takes place.
But in your view, I mean, isn't it a bit of a cop-out? Because typically, Parliament would make its recommendations to the President, and more often than not, the President then has to check whether he actually concurs, whether whatever recommendation that comes before him is constitutional, and such things. Why is this one being treated somewhat differently?
Well, actually, the Act came into force 4 years ago, and the limits were not changed. The limits were set in Schedule 2 of the Act, and they just applied, the old 100,000 and 15 million rand donation limit. And then the Act was amended last year with the introduction of independent candidates, and it was added in that Parliament could make a resolution and the President could then set these figures. So this is the first time that this has arisen. Now, it's an interesting question because there was actually a resolution in May last year that the President did not act on, and then Parliament went back and gave a new resolution, this time with recommendations. So there are some questions as to why there was no action on the previous motion in May 2024, but it is a new situation. It is the first time that the current rules are in force. So it's not that, in a way, anything funny is happening at the moment. This is as we would expect following the amendment to the Act last year.
An interesting proposition from the finance minister that political parties should perhaps be wholly funded from the fiscus so that they don't have to accept private donations.
Yes, it certainly in some ways took quite a few people by surprise, because we all know the stresses and strains we have with our budget at the moment. But this is an ANC position going back some years, that the country should aim to fully fund. Now, the finance minister left the question, well, how much is fully funding, and how do you arrive at a figure? So he put that as an aim, for people to consider going forward. It's obviously not going to happen in a hurry with our current financial constraints. But the conference also discussed the fact that the more you have public funding, the more regulation you actually need and scrutiny of the private funding that tops that up.
But does it then address, or do his proposals address the fact that as things stand, a number of political parties, including his own, the ANC, have not fully disclosed. In fact, at some point, the ANC had to be fined for not fully disclosing its finances.
There's two separate questions about the full disclosure. The first is, do parties submit their returns on time? Now, the IEC has taken a sensible approach over the years. They've given people an opportunity to put it right. And by and large, that reporting has been done successfully. The other question that was raised was, if you look at what parties appear to be spending on election campaigns, are those amounts a lot higher than the donations they are declaring? So that is a separate question. So the compliance with the Act in terms of getting their reports in is not a major problem, but it is an open question as to whether any parties, and this is not pointing fingers, are actually disclosing all of their sources of income.
Well, some people, to, I suppose, partly address the concerns that have been raised, have argued for more involvement by the IEC, closer scrutiny of party finances and generally how they conduct themselves around money and related issues.
You're correct. This is a question of public trust. And obviously, trust is one of the most precious commodities we have in a democratic environment. But a lot of the discussion that came out of the conference that is really worth digesting and working through is that, is the IEC the best institution to do this detailed scrutiny? So do they have investigative capacity, for example? But on a more philosophical level, the IEC is a neutral referee, as it were. Their job is managing elections, and some feel that it could harm perceptions of their neutrality if they are pursuing parties for non-compliance. So there's been quite a lot of very interesting discussion about maybe we need a small external unit like an inspector general to look at party funding on a, call it a more systematic manner, and be able to respond to complaints with better investigation. So that obviously the IEC, fulfilling their role of bringing these conversations to the fore, will put forward the outcomes of the conference, and Parliament will be able to consider all of these issues in much more detail as we go forward.
Of course, I did hear the Chief Electoral Officer saying, no, we are not getting too much involved in that particular discussion. We're sticking to what is currently our mandate. But any responses or any views from political parties, because linked to the money issue is, of course, the issue of, and I'm taking you back to where we started as we conclude this conversation, the issue of public trust in elections, but in particular in political parties, which in turn has the net effect of giving us poorly, elections that are not as legitimate, perhaps is the question, is what I should use, as they perhaps should be. Any discussions around that outside of the issue of funding?
Look, obviously some of those questions arose. The focus was primarily funding, but yes, there was quite a lot of discussion. Certainly, like the discussion, should public funds be distributed proportionally according to the size of parties, or should an election be fought more on, as they call them, leveling the playing fields? And, why should a party go into an election based on their success in the past election with funding? So a lot of those discussions were held, where the state funding is available, how should that be distributed among the parties? And one of the key themes with that is also extending the funding to local government representation. There are a number of smaller or regional parties who are very active in local government, but are not currently part of the funding regime, as it were. So I think there was a lot of taking it seriously, but without any clear, definitive final positions being taken. It was a very helpful way to take stock and get a good basis to look at future developments in this area.
The reason I was asking that question, at least in part, of course, is because, if you're going to spend a lot of money, which is, funding political parties who are contesting elections, but you have the participation rate is very low, that's tantamount to robbing current and future generations of much needed money, especially given our fiscal situation as a country. So I thought it would automatically form part of those conversations.
The emphasis was more, actually, I think it was quite favorably received, this idea of increasing state funding, even though it's not yet clear how quickly or to what extent the fiscus can sustain this. There was discussion, for example, about how private funding tends to reduce reliance on the membership within parties and allow elites within parties to control the processes of those parties. So the discussion was really a well-rounded discussion with a lot of different aspects. So it's hard to pin down, like any one area, as you're mentioning.
Of the funding of the IEC itself, so that it can do more voter education programs, so that it can look at other forms, or shall I add more expensive forms of ensuring that elections are indeed free and fair.
Many people have commented that the IEC is not funded sufficiently. Of course, the Minister of Finance gave us the assurance in his address this morning that they are looking after the IEC and they will continue to do so. And if I may observe, the Chief Electoral Officer was more or less duty bound to agree with him publicly in that moment. But some of the delegates did raise the need for public education. And in fact, one proposal was there should be less funding of parties and more funding of civic education, through the IEC. So we all understand the financial constraints, and I think all of us in this sector really feel for the IEC, but there is a consensus, as you say, there is a real need for ongoing voter engagement and that is the IEC's responsibility.
Michael Atkins, let me thank you very much for your time and insights. He's been attending that symposium hosted by the IEC to look at political funding in South Africa.